this is a photo of me and my students before the pandemic, obviously. And this is sort of like a Where's Waldo image. Where's Kimberly? I'm in the front row there with the checkered shirt. The middle-aged woman there. Shout out to any of my students who are here with us right now. Uh, Look how blissfully unaware we all are of what's ahead of us. I'm sharing this photo with you because honestly, this is me in my happy place, the classroom. And it's still been a happy place during the pandemic. It's just been a different place. I'm not sure, maybe happy is too strong of a word for this year, but being around my students is the best for me. I started teaching, wow, 30 years ago. I started in 1991, and here I am. I'm still completely absorbed by, excited, confounded by this thing we call teaching and learning. And today I teach 2 inquiry-based classes. They're all undergraduate classes at the University of Washington here in Seattle. And as Kirsten mentioned, I discovered inquiry-based instruction very, very early on in my career. I feel lucky about that. And it really coalesced, I feel, when I became a principal in Athens, Greece, and I was asked to implement something called the IB's Primary Years Program. And this was 1998. It had just really started. I then later started Inquiry Partners so I could offer teachers practical ways to implement inquiry and to really share my enthusiasm for inquiry-based instruction more broadly. So this is why I'm so happy to be here with you right now. So first things first, let's just get settled a little bit. If Zoom has taught me anything, it's that disconnection and multitasking are among the chief enemies of online learning. And I put myself in that category. I'm just as guilty as my own students. So in anticipation of this, I would just like to invite you right now to set up your physical space, grab some paper and something to write with, refill your coffee cup or your teacup, turn off your phone, shut the door, make sure you're comfortably seated or maybe you're standing, and then your mind space. Just quickly set an intention for the next hour and try and turn on that beginner's mind, that open mind, and give yourself the gift of focus and attention. All right, let's get started. Here's what I'm excited to share with you. And I'll invite you to participate with me as we go along. So first, we're going to explore more deeply this concept of creative destruction. And next, we're going to practice it. So I'm going to offer a couple strategies for doing that. And finally, we're going to, with the space we create through the destruction, I'm going to introduce some new ways of, in the words of educator John Hyder, we're going to try and help ourselves and our students see things backwards, inside out, and upside down. Let's start with a question, though. What does this very paradoxical couple words mean to you? When you hear the words creative destruction, what comes to mind? And I'd like you to just take a moment and jot down some words, examples, or even a visual. And if you feel so inclined, go ahead and share it in the chat as well.
Lots of interesting things being shared here.
Yeah.
Destruction leads to creativity. It means taking ideas, concept, and items apart, playing with them. Destroy the old. I love this one from Summit. Destroy the old to create space for something new. That's amazing, isn't it? Nita says it made her think of the Hindu god Shiva, and Anita is saying destruction that is fruitful. I'm just going to finish with one from Iman in Al Mofti. You need to break down in order to create.
Thank you so much for sharing those. So keep those by your side. I'm going to share a quick story with you. And it's a story that immediately came to my mind when I started thinking about this idea of creative destruction. And perhaps it'll resonate with your initial thinking here. This is Luna and Maeve. They're two savvy entrepreneurs in the middle of yet another corporate overhaul. The coffee shop that they built brought in a steady stream of customers and a tidy profit.
You're going to learn about what they are, how to declare them.
But then the muses, someone else started talking. Kirsten, is everything good? Can you hear me okay? Okay. So let's go back to Luna and Maeve. They got some success. They had customers. They brought in a tidy profit. But you know what happened? The pandemic hit and they had to rethink their entire business model. Their solution? A contactless drive-through. So they needed to tear down the original building and repurpose their bricks. And it worked great. That is until one day a customer walked up to their window with her dog. What to do? Everyone else was in a car. Was this safe? Should they serve her? Should they serve the dog? I have an idea, shouted Maeve. Let's build a separate window, one just for people not in cars. Luna thought this was great. She jumped up and down and said, yes, and another window just for pets. They knocked down their bricks to start again and set out to create 3 drive-through windows. To me, this is a beautiful example, an illustration of creative destruction in action. But you know what's interesting? Is that when I Googled creative destruction, the first page that appeared for me was not a preschool classroom. Instead, it was an economic theory. And here's an excerpt. I'm not going to read this to you. Go ahead and just read this on your own. These are a lot of big words, and they're describing things that, for example, Uber replacing taxis, the cloud replacing photo albums, phones replacing newspapers, and yes, drive-throughs replacing sit-down coffee shops. And for many of us, quite honestly, some of these innovations can at times feel more like destructive creation than creative destruction, right? Especially when routine, our livelihoods, nostalgia are involved. I personally mourn the loss of newsprint on my kitchen table, the noise that it makes while folding it. I even missed a little bit the ink that stained my fingers until I didn't, until I learned to read the news on my phone, and it was more convenient. In other words, I learned eventually to let it go. And maybe you've noticed as you read this excerpt that there's a word repeated in this quote no fewer than 3 times. Do you see it? Incessantly is used incessantly in this paragraph, meaning over and over, without end, which is an important idea to consider when we look at other interpretations of creative destruction. It turns out, though, that economists aren't the only ones, or even really the first ones, to articulate the idea of creative destruction. And Kirsten, you already read out one of the big ideas that struck me as well. Perhaps many of you recognize this Hindu god. And in the trio of principal Hindu gods, there is Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the preserver, and this one. And yes, this is Shiva, the destroyer, a god that destroys, and equal in power to the other two gods. So Shiva is fated to destroy the universe in order to bring about its regeneration. And this is important, it's not annihilation, it's transformation. And doesn't regeneration and transformation sound better than annihilation and destruction? Which makes me think words matter because they influence our beliefs, and in turn, our beliefs inform our behaviors. And when I think about that, I can't help but think about this character, Sisyphus, because just like Shiva, Sisyphus is also fated by the gods to push, in his case, a large boulder up a hill, only to have it roll down again for eternity, incessantly. And that sounds awful, doesn't it? Until you read The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus, who reframes and reimagines and uses words to do so, the story. Because in his interpretation, Sisyphus gets to celebrate an achievement when this big boulder reaches the top. And then he enjoys some rest while it rolls back down. And finally, he experiences the joy of opportunity when it's time to push it back up again. And in the words of Camus, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. And then there is this interpretation of creative destruction, and this comes from Liberating Structures. It's the eco cycle, and it's expressed through seasonal changes. So in this image, creative destruction is conceived within the context of a naturally occurring cycle, also infinite and unending, incessant. Now, as you look at this image, and there's a lot to take in here, I wonder where you would put your finger if I asked you, where does it start? And what if I asked you, how might you plot where you are right now in your life? Now that's broadly interpreted, so you could interpret that however you want. What if I asked you, where are you in terms of the school year? Or how about a unit of inquiry? Or how about in regards to belief that you have? And this last question actually makes me think of Ron Richart and Mark Church and the work they do with making thinking visible. The "I used to think, now I think" phrase. Which beliefs, especially in the last year, have you destroyed? And what are they being replaced with? Now follow me to the two traps you see on the sides of this infinite loop. And let's start with a poverty trap on the left side. Notice that its placement is between gestation and birth. And the poverty trap for me is when you don't give your nascent ideas enough of a push. Like you're thinking about running to get in shape, but you're not investing in buying the shoes that would make your running possible. What might be something in your life that is stuck in this poverty trap? For me right now, it's thinking about writing another book, but not setting time aside to actually do it. And on the other end is the rigidity trap. And this comes in between maturity and creative destruction. And you know what? We adults, we get stuck here a lot. And I think that young people like Luna and Maeve have a distinct advantage here. They maneuver very quickly through this trap, right? They don't have as much baggage. They don't have history, nostalgia. You won't hear them saying, but we've always done it this way. They don't have a pasture of sacred cows chewing their cud. But notice that for creative destruction to occur, we need to confront and get through this thing called the rigidity trap. And before I move on this slide, I know we've been here a while. I wonder if you've noticed something else. And it took me a while before I did. You notice that birth is clearly labeled. And to me, it's assumed that the opposite of birth is death, right? And this got me wondering, is creative destruction just a more acceptable, palatable way of saying death? Does our collective avoidance, reluctance of talking about death, especially in some cultures, make this process of ongoing renewal more difficult? And I remember a quote by an English poet. His name is Edward Young. He once wrote that our birth is nothing but our death begun. So there are pitfalls here, lots of them for adults. And the question then is, how do we get past this rigidity trap so we can make room for renewal and innovation? And here's where I think we should start, with this woman. Because she is so sweet and she is so nice. And her name is Marie Kondo. And I'm sure many of you have read her book or seen her videos. She's the creator of the KonMari method, which is the practice of deliberately, or what economists might say, incessantly choosing physical objects in our home environments to keep and maintain, or to say goodbye to get rid of. And Marie Kondo is, for me, the midwife for creative destruction. She eases us out of the rigidity trap by using ritual and careful word choice. Because destruction, like the word death, is heavy, right? It's very final. It's a fire. It's a chemical change. It scares people. But instead, Marie Kondo says, let it go. Like a bird, you would carefully lift up to the sky and watch it fly away. And I think she's onto something here. She guides us to hold objects lovingly in our hands and to say, thank you. Thank you for the joy you once brought to me, before letting it go. A gardener might call this pruning. And the brilliance of this method is that once you get comfortable with separating from physical objects, it becomes easier to separate from other things, like beliefs, like relationships and behaviors that no longer serve you, or, in the words of Marie Kondo, spark joy. So I'm going to invite you right now to just pause and take a moment, and wherever you are in the world, in time and space, to look around right now. Maybe you're in a home office, or you're at school, or you're in your yard, or maybe you're not in your physical space, but you have a purse or backpack nearby. You can look into that and find something in there or around you that maybe doesn't serve a purpose anymore or bring you joy. And if you're willing, share what you're finding in the chat.
some fun things coming up. I've got some dead flowers in my living room. So somebody else was saying children's toys, and somebody saying an old fan, and lots of things. Somebody said old clothes, a dead tree outside my window. Lots of dead things. A flag I bought last year, and somebody said, "Oh, I love this one. Looking at my phone, and I need to delete unnecessary apps." That's a really cool one. I do that. The other thing I do is I go through my email from time to time and delete things that I've signed up for that I no longer want notifications of, because you never get any real mail because you're just getting all these notifications from things you're following.
That's
so
right.
Oh, somebody says, I don't find joy in my lace curtains anymore. Okay, kunmari them. Kunmari them.
Don't worry them. Yes. Let it go. Thank you, lace curtains. At once you were grand and beautiful, and no longer.
So lots going up. Great prompt.
Here's what I found. I actually, my home office is.
Can I have them?
You can have them. I will send them to you. I will warn you, they are probably the world's most uncomfortable shoe. And I am in my closet. I live in a teeny tiny house with my teacher husband and 2 children, one of whom is home from college. I looked around this space and I looked at my shoes and I immediately found these green numbers, and they were collecting dust, quite literally. They're covered with dust because I live these days in flip-flops, socks, or tennis shoes. I've had them for several years. I almost never wear them. I mean, even when back in the day when we dressed up to go places, the one time I wore them, I got lots of compliments and lots of blisters too. And they were so uncomfortable and actually quite dangerous. But here's what I did. I took them out of my closet. I thanked them for their service and their brief moment of joy. And I put them in a bag to give away. Now I'll give them to Kirsten. And guess what happened when I pulled them out? I found behind these shoes in my closet a box of letters from my students that were hiding. And I pulled it out. I had completely forgotten I had this box of letters. And I relabeled it the "This Is Why" box. Thank you to my friend Ellen Dorr, who says that she, as a teacher, always had a "This Is Why" box to remind her on those days why she's doing what she's doing. And you know what? I've needed this box so badly this year. So thank you, Marie Kondo. I got rid of what I didn't need. And look, I found what I did need. And physical objects are one way of practicing creative destruction. The harder part are the ideas and the behaviors that are driven by those ideas, right? So I'm going to try with you another purging activity. And this time we're going to focus on practices that don't serve us or our students anymore. And this, quite frankly, is one of the most revealing and fun, playful structures I've discovered over the last couple of years. This one is called TRIZ. It's a liberating structure. It's a Russian engineering term. And the process is designed to unleash innovation through basically reverse engineering. Okay, I'm just realizing that all sounds pretty confusing, but hang in there with me. What we're going to do is we're going to use this structure to identify and stop counterproductive actions that we see in our work as teachers or administrators, so that we can make more space for innovation, so we can do different things instead of layering all these things on like a lasagna. In other words, we're going to engage in a form of creative destruction for our professional practice as inquiry teachers. And here's how it works. So instead of asking, how could we reliably create the best environment for inquiry? That's a question we probably have interrogated quite a bit. We're going to flip this and we're going to ask instead, how could we reliably create the worst environment for inquiry. You see where this gets fun? So I'm going to now for a minute give you some space to just jot down a list of all the ways you could possibly achieve this. And yes, your list will sound absurd and hopefully hilarious. And that is totally okay.
Getting some fun stuff coming through again.
Great.
Standardized tests based on useless content. That might be my favorite.
Yeah.
Teachers ask questions and answer it themselves. I remember that from when I was at school.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, listen to this. No, not giving space, no time to ponder, no windows, no questioning, tons of worksheet, only teachers giving out instructions, lots of textbooks, micromanagement from above. Telling kids what to be curious about. That's an oxymoron, right? I'm going to tell you what to be curious about. Yes, miss.
Enjoy it.
That's terrible. Okay. Increase teacher talk time, textbooks, no student wonderings, contents, making it teacher directed, lots of teacher driven things. Where are we going? Do it just before going to sleep. I like the humor. That's terrible.
This usually generates a lot of really funny. I mean, if there are any, I encourage you to do this with staff. This is actually a really fun process. With any kind of question, just flip it and see what comes out.
That's very cool. Thank you for the strategy as well. I think that's a great strategy we could use in our classrooms as well. Think about the opposite of what we're trying to determine or create and ask what it would look like could really engage the brain. It's very cool. Thanks a lot.
Flipping things, flipping as much as possible. Right. So I'm going to share with you what I wrote. I did this earlier today. Here's my list. It probably looks similar. I understand someone also wrote, don't put any windows in the classroom so people can't get curious. No posters either. So, so we have this list. Now you can do this, if you were with staff or students, you could have them do it together in small groups or pairs. The next step is just to go down your list and to identify a current practice of yours that resembles in any way, shape, or form something on your list. And for this, you have to be brutally honest. Is there anything that resembles your current practice on your list? And I'm going to share mine with you right now. So for me, it's that second one that I've listed with the asterisks. Students cannot ask questions. Okay, now this exaggerates what actually happens in my classroom, but I actually, like all of you, I try very hard to unleash student questions, but I did, however, have this habit of choosing a set of 4 starter questions when we invited in guest speakers to our classroom. And I guess I did this because I thought it would be good for them to see how multiple speakers responded to the same questions, and so that they could look for patterns over time. But you know what I found out when I actually asked students and Cindy Blackburn, if you're here with us right now, Cindy on Twitter has this practice where she asks her students, what should I start, stop, and continue? I basically did this with my students, and they said, in a very kind way, we need to stop asking the same questions because it gets boring and I tune out. Imagine that, students tuning out of questions they themselves didn't ask. So I promised to stop insisting that specific questions are asked of our guest speakers. And it was my students who finally nudged me out of that rigidity trap. They asked if they could change up the interview process entirely. And now They actually do all the research on the guest speakers. They meet with the person in advance. They design their own questions. They design their sequencing. It is not only so much better, but it saves me a lot of time too. So, what can I stop? The liberating thing about this liberating structure is that you are taking something off your plate. So take a moment now, and the challenge is to write a stop statement. And here's mine. What is something that you will stop? And go ahead and share your stop statement in the chat.
I'm intrigued how many people say they're going to stop talking so much. That was my first kind of aha moment when when I started really thinking about student learning, was like, talk less, listen more. So it's quite interesting to see that. Wow, there's a lot. It's very, very fast. I will stop correcting the students. I will stop assuming I understand a question or response.
Mm-hmm.
That's very rich, isn't it?
It is. I mean, these are very, it comes from a very honest and vulnerable place to do this. And if you were actually all together right now, just the act of announcing this is it provides accountability. It's public accountability.
I love it. Nisha, somebody saying, I will stop following a strict schedule. And this is very, very honest. I will stop the urge to prompt my students when they're pausing to think hard. That's very thoughtful. Really thoughtful. I will stop planning to fill every moment of instruction. I really recommend that one. You'll give yourself a lot less stress if you do that. Oh, and this one is going to end here. This one's lovely. Stop driving through my own agenda. Really nice.
All of these, I mean, I wish that everyone could see the nods, because we see ourselves in each other. These are very common things that we do as teachers. And so we've engaged in a process of creative destruction, right? We're talking about what we would stop. We're talking about what things we would get rid of, and letting go that that no longer serve us or our students. And so the next thing I want to explore with you is, I don't want to rush to fill in space, but the question is, what do you do with that space? And does stopping that provide now an opportunity for innovation? In other words, what's been made possible when you stop these practices? And to get out of this rigidity trap, I really feel like we need to be able to conceive of something new, to push our original thinking, to change our conceptions and perceptions of the world. It's like when we encourage people to travel, because this is what happens. Everything gets twisted and you see things in a new way and you grow. And, these images here, won't surprise any of us that younger learners know that this idea instinctively. They don't have passports, they don't travel, but you know what they do? They stand upside down. I mean, watch them. They're constantly using their physical bodies to test boundaries and explore new perspectives. Very somatic. And we adults, we separate ourselves from this, right? And maybe, I guess maybe this is an advertisement for yoga, or I don't know, tap dancing, but this is why so many adults probably do benefit from things like yoga and mindfulness. Things like inversions and spinal twists are not just good for the physical body, they're good for the mind too. But you don't have to go to a yoga class, or get on a roller coaster, or stand on your head, or be Obama getting down on the ground to look at a baby's perspective. There's some other routines that I want to share with you that could be helpful both to you and your students. And the first one that I want to share comes from an organization called Teach Different. So another one of my stop statements this year was to stop calling on the same students. And I'll admit, I know, I mean, like, I know this is bad practice, but I get lazy sometimes. I just think, you know, I'm sort of given up on the other students, and I'm just going to go with it. You know, the same few students that are, you know, keep their cameras on and are willing to participate, I just go with it. But I can do better. And I made a statement that I would stop doing this. So when I stopped calling on these students, something had to give because it was silent. And I know I'm not alone in struggling with this issue. But here's what happened. When I stopped, it made space for something else. And when there's space, I often find that helpers come on board, or at least I recognize them better. And enter Dan and Steve Fouts, twin brothers from Chicago, who have codified a deceptively simple process for getting more students involved in inquiry and deep discussion. And they call it Teach Different. And I'm so excited to share it with you right now. Here's how it starts. You start with a provocation, a provocative quote that is germane to your unit of inquiry or an essential question. So here's one for us. This is Pablo Picasso. Every act of creation is an act of destruction. And this is perfect because it's short and pithy. And why is that important? Because everyone can engage. It doesn't require a lot of pre-reading or homework. It draws upon your experiences and your extant knowledge. In other words, everyone can jump in. Everyone has access. And here's where I've really messed up in the past. Because I am a person with a strong action bias, I have often allowed students to dive right into the discussion. I mean, they seem so excited. I mean, at least those students whose hands shot up at first were. But this routine asks me and people like me to press pause and to extend thinking time. And this is one of the 5 inquiry strategies that's in my book. I should know better. And by doing this, you're offering students the gift of time to think deeply and from different perspectives before getting into the discussion. And you're building a disposition of, which I love, seeking first to understand before being understood. So to guide students, this is just a simple structure they offer. First, have students identify the claim here, and then have them think of a personal story that they want to offer to support the claim. Second, now here's where building empathy and perspective taking skills comes in. What's the counterclaim? And what's a story to support that counterclaim? And finally, what is one question that this quote raises for you? So I'm going to pause, and I invite you to try this out. How might you answer these 3 prompts based on Picasso's quote? Let's just take a minute and go ahead and jot down your thoughts. And if you want to share in the chat your question, that would be great.
Some questions coming up. Does this apply to concepts or real world phenomena? How do we make a choice what to destroy and what to let go? Does all destruction lead to creation? Why can't it be creation from nothing? like the very first time the universe was created. What was destroyed to make the universe? We go back to the beginning of time. We've got a few claims as well. Is it a biased creation? And one very specific was Picasso destroying the way things really look like in order to create his art. There's quite a thread here actually saying, do you really need to destroy something to create something new?
Okay, so the pause button is still pressed. Let's pretend. I know that Kirsten has shared some things from you already, but let's assume your students did this on their own, right? And they share their responses on a Google Doc or any sort of app or recording that you want to use, so that the teacher or whoever is facilitating, because maybe it's a student that eventually facilitates, knows in advance what their answers are, just very briefly, and how they would like to engage in the discussion. And Teach Different calls this the SEL, the social emotional learning check-in. And you'll see there are 4 choices students can make here. And they can choose as many as they want. Like maybe they are comfortable sharing their question, but not necessarily their claims or counterclaims and their stories. So with this information now, the facilitator or teacher knows which students are ready to start the discussion, which comments they can lift up anonymously to keep the conversation going, and which students might need a gentle nudge. And you know what happens? Students start talking and they see each other talking and they realize that it's safe to do so. Hey, the water's fine, come in. And they start like civic dialogue and deep thinking and question asking because, and we already know this, they were academically and emotionally prepared to do so. So here's an example. I did this one with my students recently. One student's claim is written here. Okay, and the story that they told was that forest fires naturally occur because nature knows that forest fires, help get rid of dead or dying plant matter, and that this helps give the soil minerals so that new plants sprout. Their counterclaim is written here, and their story was kind of funny. They said, this is kind of embarrassing, but I've been lifting weights this year and I've created bigger muscles and I didn't have to destroy my muscles first. I mean, they're still there. They're just different. And by the way, when this came up in conversation, we had a very lively debate about whether muscles getting injured is a form of destruction. And then finally, the question, this was the question that they asked. What's the difference between destruction and creative destruction? And this part of the conversation in my class was really interesting because a lot of people agreed that creative destruction involved choice, consent to be destroyed, agreement, intention. But then someone brought up the fact that a computer hard drive was wiped out and it was debilitating, but it made that person realize how important it was for that to happen. And that maybe the consent wasn't important. It was just the fact that he got a fresh start. These are my students engaging in the conversation. I've tried to blur out their faces. But the last step is really important because after the conversation reached its natural conclusion, and this took about 75 minutes, students were then asked to do some process reflection and shout out their classmates. And so a robust conversation ends with people feeling elevated, courageous, even more curious. And this process by Teach Different is now in the birth stage of my teaching practice. And I can imagine it maturing. And yes, at some point turning into mulch and it making room for more innovation. Here's another way to sort of get students thinking very differently. It's by spending time celebrating mistakes which we don't often do, right? Through something called mistake analysis. And this routine comes from Colin Seal. He's a former teacher and lawyer, and he combined these two professions to create an organization called Think Law. And he promotes critical thinking. And so in his book, Think Like a Lawyer, he shares routines that, for me, creatively destroy some prevailing ideas. Like, wrong ideas are just wrong. And he's got me thinking about the power of lingering longer on our mistakes and spending more time learning from them instead of rushing to right answers. Here's an example he gives. Take a problem. I'm going to show you a math example, but it could be grammar or a scientific hypothesis. And then submit a couple plausible answers for analysis. Now here's the kicker. The question, which wrong is more right, is brilliant, isn't it? Not only do we need to understand the math to determine where the mistake happened, but we need to then justify which one is less egregious, which makes this a divergent problem with endless answers. So here's how this one might play out. You'll notice that student A understands the operation, that 48 apples are added to 8. But there's a calculation error, right? The place values aren't lined up correctly. Whereas student B misinterpreted the problem completely, thinking that the question was asking about how many apples were gained. But the calculation was perfect. Here are the students' responses to arguing that student A, that answer was more right versus B. The last exercise I want to share with you is a recent riff off of the question formulation technique. And I'm sure there are lots and lots of people right now who are using the QFT. And I would put this practice right now in the maturity box of my eco-cycle, my practice. It's starting to evolve, and it's a structure that I think is beautiful because it helps students ask more and better questions, but we're outgrowing it. And so I've been combining the QFT with the IB's key questions to help students ask different kinds of questions from multiple perspectives. So let's try this out really quickly. You have an image here. Write as many questions as you can, and let's just take a minute. Okay, finish up your last question there. So here's what I wrote. Maybe you have similar questions. If you follow the question formulation technique, we would then identify each question as either open, divergent, or closed, convergent. And you notice that, not surprisingly, my first questions are very closed. I only have one open. But here's the riff. What if instead of open, close, we placed each of my questions into one of these 8 key question categories, and we look for patterns? Where do the questions on your list land? Take a moment and just see where they might fit. And imagine if students were doing this in pairs or small groups, the kinds of conversations and debates that would flourish as they negotiate this step. Here's where my 7 questions ended up. And as you can see, I have a lot of form questions, which isn't uncommon in the first minute of the QFT. But I can spend now another minute intentionally creating questions that get me to think about function. And here's what I came up with when I pushed a little. How do rocks split in half? Or perspective. Does the rock feel any pain? And responsibility. How can we ensure that trees have space to grow? And to help students develop more perspective questions, you could also assign them different roles, like ask all the questions you can about this image as though you were a mathematician or a farmer or a bird. Kirsten, you want to share anything from the chat?
I was just wanted to say we've only got a couple of minutes left on the session, but there's lots of people are just loving this strategy. That's what I'm seeing is love this strategy. This is a brilliant strategy. This is a huge share. This is a fantastic mashup. I just love this. That's what I wanted to tell you mostly.
Well, since we only have a couple minutes left, I want to finish where we started and check in with our young entrepreneurs here. Luna and Maeve did end up getting 2 of the 3 drive-throughs built, but it wasn't easy. They didn't have sufficient capital. Building a drive-through just for pets wasn't an option. Still, business was booming. And after setting up efficiency systems and they got lots of repeat customers, they frankly started to get bored. Let's build the highest tower we can. And without a second thought, they knocked down the blocks to start another venture. When I feel myself in the rigidity trap, I remember Luna and Maeve, and I try to embody the true spirit of creative destruction. As we endure this global pandemic that has really destroyed so much in the last year, I hope that we can all take time to pause and enter a stage of renewal, knowing that change is inevitable. It's natural, and yes, it's incessant. And in the end, creative destruction is about letting go and not holding on too tight to any object, any belief, any person. And it's about being wildly grateful for the joy that it has brought to our lives.